This video is sponsored by Wagner Meters. Visit them at wagnermeters.com. My wife asked if I would make her a hamper for the kids' clothes, and I decided that I would make it out of cherry. The hamper may or may not have a cloth insert. We haven't exactly decided yet. For the leg stock, I'm going to use 8/4 cherry, and I've already cut this to rough length. So the next thing I'm going to do is get a nice straight edge at the joiner, and then I'm going to go over to the bandsaw and cut the legs out to rough width. After I started to mark out these legs to rough width using the marking gauge, I realized that I actually have more than enough material to make these cuts at the table saw instead of the bandsaw, and I'll get a much cleaner cut at the table saw. Now that I have all the leg blanks roughed out, I can, at the joiner, flatten one face and then square one adjoining face. I've got all of the rails cut to rough length. Now I just need to put a straight edge on one side at the joiner, and then I'll rip them to rough width at the table saw. Now that I have all the end grain mortises out of the way, I'm going to start working on the mortises in the legs. And again, I'm going to use my horizontal mortiser. But if you don't have a horizontal mortiser, you can make these mortises using a plunge router and an edge guide. And you could also even make the end grain mortises using a special fixture. And in the description of the video down below, I'll have more information if you'd like to make that fixture to make the end grain mortises. A few of the rails are going to have an arch cut out on the bottom portion of the rail. And in order to make those arches, I first made a template, and then I traced out those arches onto the rails. And at the bandsaw, I cut close to the line, and I'll take it all the way to the line using the router table with two router bits. I'm going to use a flush trim bit with a bearing on the top, and then I'm going to switch over to a pattern bit, which has the bearing on the bottom. And that way I can always cut downhill and avoid cutting uphill, which has a greater chance of causing chip out. Now that I have the grooves out of the way in the legs to receive the panels, I need to next make the grooves in the rails to receive the panels as well. And some of the grooves that I need to make are going into the curved section of the rail. Now, in order to pull that off, I'm gonna use a slot cutter at the table saw. And in order to lessen the amount of chip out that I might get, I took some blue tape and I just put it over the edge of the board. Because my work is curved, I can't use the router table fence as I push the work into the slot cutter. So in my opinion, a safe way to do this is to use a starting pin. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna first push the workpiece until it makes contact with the starting pin, and I'm not making contact with the router bit at this point. And then I'm just gonna slowly pivot the work into the router bit until the corner of the workpiece makes contact with the bearing. And then I'm gonna pivot off of the starting pin at that point and then glide the work across the bearing. This material that I just finished rounding over on each edge is going to make up the loose tenon stock, and I'm going to cut each piece to length by using the table saw sled. I need to make a groove at the bottom on the inside face of all the rails to receive the hamper bottom. And to make those grooves, I'm going to use a stacked dado set at the table saw. I need to make slots in the bottom of each leg to receive the bottom of the hamper. And I don't want these slots to intersect the mortises for the tenons, because I don't want glue from the tenons getting into the groove where the bottom is going to go. So I needed to stop short of this mortise wall. So in order to control the length or the stopping position of this slot, I used a stop right behind my miter gauge. In order to control the position of this slot along the length of the leg, I'm just using my fence to register the bottom of the leg off of as I drop the piece on top of the bit. In order to control the stop for the second part of the groove so it again doesn't penetrate the mortise for the tenon, I had to use a stop on the opposite side of the cut. These 5/4 cherry boards are going to make up the panels for the hamper. And now that I have them cut to rough length and I have a straight edge on one side, I can cut them to rough width. Before I resaw this board at the bandsaw, I'm going to go ahead and get a moisture content reading using my Wagner moisture meter. Now from this number, it'll tell me how much I can expect the lumber to expand or contract as the seasons change. Now when I bring this piece indoors, it's going to be a little bit drier inside than it is in this shop. So I would expect the lumber to contract a little bit, but I don't know how much until I get a reading. So this lumber right now is sitting at 12.6% moisture content. Now I know that indoors in my house, the relative humidity is 48%. Now I have a calculator on my website where you can take that 48% and plug it in and it'll give you a calculated equilibrium moisture content for wood that's indoors. And it gives me 8.9% moisture content. Now, if I take this number 12.6 and the final number would be 8.9, I have another calculator where it'll actually calculate how much you can expect the lumber to contract. Now from these values, it gives you an idea of how much room to leave when you go to size the panel to the opening in the frame, and it's really helpful. And I'll have a link to these calculators in the video description of this video. Most homes in the United States will fluctuate between an extreme low of a 25% relative humidity to an extreme high of 65% relative humidity, depending on where you live. Now, from those two extremes, you could calculate using my online calculator an extreme low equilibrium moisture content and an extreme high equilibrium moisture content for your lumber indoors. Now, if you know your starting moisture content of your lumber from your meter reading, you could then, you're much better shape when you go to size the panel to its opening in the frame, because you can better gauge how much the lumber is going to expand and contract throughout the year as the seasons change. I have the resawn face down on my joiner so that I can flatten that face. But because this board is wider than the capacity of my 8-inch joiner, I'm gonna overhang it by a little bit. And this little section that I can't get at the joiner, I'm gonna get with a hand plane. One more pass of the joiner and then a little bit more hand plane work should do it for this face. By taking into account the moisture content of the lumber that I use for my panels that I got from my Wagner moisture meter, I'm gonna rip these panels to their final width. Because my panels are all book matched, I want to keep the glue line exactly in the center, so I want to remove the same amount of material from both sides. I need to curve the tops of all the panels that are going to go into the curved rails. So I traced out the curve and I'll cut it out of the bandsaw. I have the sides out of the clamps, and I have a dry assembly connecting the two sides together so that I could measure for the panel length and width for the bottom. For the bottom, I'm going to use a piece of 1/4 inch thick plywood, and I've actually already cut it to length and width. And the next thing I need to do is cut out the corners. I need to make a notch in each of the 4 corners of the bottom so that it can go around this section of the post in each corner. With a piece of scrap plywood, I made a test notch just to make sure that I have the right setup on my sled before I make the cuts on the actual piece of plywood. Now that I have the base of the hamper out of the clamps, I can start working on the lid. And I'm going to get that from 3 pieces of 4/4 cherry. I intentionally made the rear rail wider than the side rails so that the top of the rear rail is flush with the back 2 legs, so that when the lid opens up, there's no gap in the back and there's a place to put the hinges. And actually the rear rail was also supposed to be flush with the 2 rear legs in the back, so that as the lid swings open, the back of the lid won't hit the back of the legs. And that's actually how I drew it in CAD. But when I laid out the mortises in the rear portion where the rear rail is going to go and the legs, I forgot to set the position of the mortises so that this rear rail is flush or meets flush with the back of the leg. So I have about 1/8 of an inch gap in between the back face of the rear rail and the legs. So in order to make up that distance so that I can set the hinges for the lid and so that the lid won't hit the back of the legs, I'm gonna have to put in this little filler piece. And I'll just glue this on, and I round it over the bottom of this filler piece so that it will blend in a little bit more. But it's gonna be in the back, and I don't think anybody will ever notice. I've got the top out of the clamps, and with a few passes through the drum sander, I'll clean it up. In order to make the top appear a little lighter, I'm going to use a core box bit on the underside of the perimeter of the top, with the exception of the back. I finished the hamper with a few coats of armor seal, and I also attached a lid support which will hold the lid open at very close to 90 degrees. It also has somewhat of a soft close to it, which I like. If you enjoyed watching this build, I hope you will like and subscribe, and also I hope that you would consider becoming a supporter of Garage Woodworks through Patreon. And you'll find a link to my Patreon page in the video description below. I'll see you all next time.
I like woodworking.